Welcome to the conversation presented by the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. My name is Paul Grondahl. I'm the director of the Writers Institute. Before I introduce today's guest, Kevin C. Fitzpatrick, let me remind you that this and all of our author interviews are archived on our YouTube channel, so you can watch them at your convenience. Also, to keep up to date on all of the Writers Institute programming, you can go to our website, nyswritersinstitute.org, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you like this kind of programming and want to support more of it, you can make a donation at our website, nyswritersinstitute.org. We'd be very grateful for that. So Kevin C. Fitzpatrick is the author and editor of 8 books that examine many facets of New York City history, particularly its literary history. He's a third-generation New Yorker who is also a licensed New York City sightseeing guide. He's written and edited 4 books celebrating the wits of the Algonquin Round Table, especially Dorothy Parker. His books include A Journey into Dorothy Parker's New York, Dorothy Parker Complete Broadway, 1918 to 1923, and Under the Table, a Dorothy Parker cocktail guide. Kevin also founded the Dorothy Parker Society in 1998. Kevin, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, Paul. It's always great to talk about New York City writers with you.
I should say we know each other. We've worked several years on this event, the New York State Writers Hall of Fame, presented by the Empire Center for the Book, and the Writers Institute has been a co-sponsor. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but it was virtual this year, but it's been a great event at the Princeton Club over the years. And we gather traditionally at the Algonquin afterwards for a nightcap. So for people listening to this who might not know, why was the Algonquin Hotel so famous, and why was Dorothy Parker there?
Good question, Paul. Well, what happened is when World War I wound down in 1919, Alexander Wolcott, who was the dramatic critic for the New York Times, returned from France, and 2 publicists, John Peter Toohey and Murdoch Pemberton, wanted to get their new show into the Times. So they took him to lunch at the hotel because it had a very well-known pastry chef, and he was kind of a big guy. The Algonquin is on 44th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, very close to where the Times was located at the time on 43rd Street. They got no luck getting their story into the Times, but did get war stories from Wolcott. So that gave them the idea of having a Welcome Back to New York luncheon or roast for this guy. And who they invited were writers, critics, Broadway people to the hotel for a roast and a luncheon. And it was a fantastic time. Everybody had a really, really fine day. And on their way out, someone said, why don't we do this again? So they came back the next day and the next day and the next day. So for the next several years, about 6 times a week, that group, which grew to about 30 people, came to the hotel, had a big round table, and they became the toast of New York. And the reason they got famous so quickly is what they were saying was getting repeated by the news services, the wire service. So if you said something at lunch that day, it would be on the wires in the newspapers that evening or the next day. So that really helped make the hotel so famous.
People were brilliant writers, but also quick-witted, snappy repartee. I mean, they would be the influencers today, right? They would be millions of followers on Twitter because they were so clever, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And, people coast to coast knew these names, and that added to the allure of the hotel, which then traded on that. And now here we are 100 years later after they had their first luncheon, and people are still talking about, this pretty well-known hotel in Manhattan.
Right. And Dorothy Parker was at the center of it. I mean, her writing is so fresh today and so witty. Talk about your interest in her. I mean, she was a young woman at a time when there were not a lot of women writing for the slicks and glossies, right? She broke into Vogue, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker. What was your interest in Dorothy Parker?
Yes, you're right. In a time when Broadway had 80, have less than 40. I was drawn to her in the 90s because I thought I had a lot in common with her. There was um, both writers, bad jobs, bad relationships, bad apartments. And I just really, was drawn to her writing because unlike a lot of writing from that era, it's not ephemeral. It hasn't not aged. It's, writing about the human condition in, 1921 is the same as 2021. And I think that's why people like, Edna St. Vincent Millay aren't as read as much as Parker is, because while Millay might have been a better poet technically, what Parker was doing was talking about, falling in love, or, New York, or speakeasies, and things that people can still identify with today. And so what happened is in 1998, I was looking for a research project about New York books and history. And a friend had given me Marion Mead's biography, What Fresh Hell Is This? And I realized that Parker and I were both Upper West Siders. And I thought that if I could use that book as a jumping off place to find all the places that Parker lived and worked in Manhattan, I could create this website, which became dorothyparker.com. And that led to walking tours and the Dorothy Parker Society with my friends the following year. So it all was tied in at the very beginning, just to be about New York and history and books. And that's how I got on the Dorothy Parker bandwagon.
So I know you give tours of various facets of New York City history. How popular is that Dorothy Parker tour compared to some of the others that you give?
It's one of my top ones. I've been giving it for more than 20 years. I started in 1999. I'm doing it again for Dorothy Parker's birthday weekend, August 20th and 21st. It's not just a fun walking a writer's footsteps, but you're actually experiencing a really historic neighborhood where everyone, from J.D. Salinger to John Updike, all kinds of, New York writers also walked in those places and went to the same kinds of places too. And that's what's fun for me, is showing people not just where Parker lived and worked, but also it's a great neighborhood as well too.
Right. I think to me, what also impresses me with Parker, she has such a wide bandwidth. She could write poetry, she could write Broadway reviews, she could write on deadline, she could do kind of talk of the town, atmospheric pieces. What made her so good in your book in terms of her prose and her style?
I'm glad you said that, because what happens a lot, and it seems like every 10 years there's like a new Dorothy Parker, and someone is always getting compared to Dorothy Parker, like Fran Lebowitz. Well, I'm a big fan of hers, but there's really not that much in common. You got to think of Parker like a baseball player, like what a 5-tool player is. You know what 5 tools are?
Remind us. I think I know, but you know better than I do.
Hitting, running, base stealing, fielding, and I think the other one is hitting for power.
Okay.
Look, someone from Cooperstown is going to tell us what the 5-tool baseball player is.
There's an expert out there for everything.
But see, Parker could write poetry, journalism, screenplays, Broadway plays, and reviews. So she was doing all of that. Show me someone who has written, 300 poems, 50 short stories, Oscar-nominated screenplays, and Broadway shows. And really, there's nobody in the Twitterverse that is doing that today. I got attracted to her because what she was writing about really spoke to me as a New Yorker, and I can continue to find new things in her words that, even though they're 100 years old or 90 years old, they still matter and they still have power in meaning to me.
It amazes me too. I mean, she and that whole group were hard drinking, and yet they were still very productive, writing a lot of words every week. How big of a drinker was Dorothy Parker? Could she drink the men under the table?
Well, the first thing you should know is the entire time the Round Table met was during Prohibition. So there was no drinking at the Round Table. There was no bar in the hotel. So all that took place at speakeasies and parties afterwards. Everybody drank back then, and unfortunately people, like Robert Benchley, died of an early age from heavy drinking. Parker lived a long time. She died when she was 73. The joke is, she was taken to a AA meeting, And she said, well, I'm not going to go back. They want me to stop now. But, they just kind of, went along. But I don't really focus too much on the drinking part, because it just kind of all goes into the what she's putting on the page, which is talking about the effects and, going out for another drink and things like that.
Right. I mean, the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age, it certainly was a time for imbibing. But let's talk about this amazing journey that you really were at the center of, to bring her home, to bring her ashes and remains back to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where her family is buried. So walk us through. She died essentially widowed, alone on the Upper East Side in the Volney Hotel, 1965. It's just her and her dog, and someone finds her body. And then tell us what happened. Lillian Hellman was involved. There was issues over executor of her will, and she gave the money and her estate to an astonishing, the recipient was even astonished. Kind of take us through that, Kevin.
Sure. Well, what happened is Dorothy Parker drew up her will in 1964, and she named the executive of her estate Lillian Hellman, who was her friend and frenemy. But she left her estate to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man she never met. Parker had been interested in civil rights going back into the 1920s and written about social justice issues her entire life. I mean, her FBI file is this thick. And so it was a shock to Hellman that when Parker died in June 1967, that while she was the executrix, she got left nothing. And that was very, frustrating to her. She actually ended up suing the NAACP because after King was assassinated, the estate rolled over to the NAACP at Parker's wishes, which wasn't a lot of money at the time, but has since grown, exponentially. The thing that Hellman didn't do was claim Parker's cremains after she was cremated in Hartsdale, New York, and they sat in a crematory for a number of years until the early 70s, when the urn was shipped to her attorney, Paul O'Dwyer's office on Lower Broadway, which is where they sat until 1988, when they finally were returned to the NAACP, who took them to Baltimore and built a beautiful memorial garden for Dorothy Parker outside their national headquarters. And that's where they were for 30 years. Then 15 years ago, the NAACP started talking about moving their offices from Baltimore to DC once President Obama came into office. And it took a while for that to actually take place, but they have since left their office space. And so I started working with the family of Dorothy Parker, her grandnieces, to have those remains returned to New York City. Took a while, a lot of letters, a lot of emails. But last August, I took an Amtrak down with a box, got the urn, they took it out of the ground, we put it in the box, and we buried her next to her parents in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, next to her mother and father. And so, as Woodlawn says, this is her forever place. So she is now in a beautiful landmark cemetery, not too far from Herman Melville and Doctorow and a lot of really great New York names. And in about 3 weeks, we're going to unveil the gravestone on her birthday on August 22nd. It's kind of the culmination of everything I've been working on dorothyparker.com, the Dorothy Parker Society, for more than 20 years, is to do this for the family and do this for the fans, to have a place to go in New York to visit our favorite writer.
That's great. And what was her brilliant little line on the urn that contained her ashes?
Well, there's a few epitaphs, but one of the jokey ones that she wrote for Vanity Fair was "Excuse my dust." So when we put the box in the ground, I had to put something on the box, the pine box I built. So there is a brass plaque that's underground that says Dorothy R. Parker, 1893-1967, excuse my dust. So that is for all eternity,
Right.
until they move again. That's what it says.
Line. What a great line. She came up with so many brilliant quips. So talk about the train ride. You're being modest because the New Yorker sent a reporter to go along with you. The New York Times wrote a big article, got a lot of attention. You had a small tribute to Dorothy. I understand you had some brought a flask or something on the train. Talk about that train trip.
Well, Paul, I had a lot of time to think about this, 14 years of planning. So that's why I came down with a box that I had pre-measured to kind of know what an urn would fit into. I didn't want to bring her back in, a Fresh Direct or a Wegmans bag,
Right.
because it was a 50-pound thing to carry onto the train. No, I brought a flask of Dorothy Parker gin, which is made by the New York Distilling Company in Brooklyn, New York, and a bottle of tonic, a lime, and all I needed was to go to the bar car to get the ice to have a gin and tonic. Jersey, I have a cocktail with Mrs. Parker. So that was the train ride back to Penn Station before she got into her first ever Uber ride.
You took her in an Uber from Penn Station to to Woodlawn. I love that point too. Your internet got a little bit hiccupy there, so could you repeat what I know you had the gin, the tonic, the lime, and what did you do on the train?
Are you going to put this together?
Yeah, I mean, we're just gonna keep it rolling, but we couldn't
Okay.
hear the last couple sentences that you were speaking.
Sure. So when I got on, Amtrak has a bar car, but I brought my own gin, my own tonic, my own lime. I just needed their ice. So I paid $2 just for a cup of ice. So I could have a proper gin and tonic. So when we passed it, out of Maryland, and I knew that we were headed to New York City, I could have a gin and tonic with Mrs. Parker with her gin. So that was really
I've never
nice.
heard of that gin. Is it good gin? And was a gin and tonic her go-to drink or something? Or
Well, she liked highballs. Everybody likes a highball because it's just 2 ingredients.
okay.
Yeah, the gin, the company's been making it for 10 years. It does very well. It's sold internationally. And the great thing is we did a special small batch of the gin a couple of months ago. Only 250 bottles were made, signed and numbered. And then the proceeds of the sale of those to fans generated the bulk of the money we needed to pay for the gravestone.
Wow.
So what was funny, Paul, is literally people drinking martinis are paying for Dorothy Parker's gravestone.
That's beautiful, man. This really comes full circle. So what did that feel like? I know, you'd been planning it a long time. Did it feel like you were the last person? I mean, were her relatives still involved at all, or were you kind of rescued her from obscurity and forgotten in a way? Or
No, Dorothy Parker has a wonderful, warm family. Her grandnieces and grandnephew live up around Rochester.
okay,
And so I was the family representative to get this done. It was an incredible, satisfying feeling to finally accomplish this after 15 years of emails and phone calls and letters. So it was a sigh of relief, but also it was very exciting to me because I knew that I was going to be establishing a new place in New York City to remember Dorothy Parker. We have the hotel, we have plaques in different places around the city where she lived and worked, but this is, her remains. And so she is in a place with people that she knew in her life, people like Irving Berlin and George M. Cohan, all of these great entertainers that she wrote about. There's more than 200 performers that she reviewed. They're all in Woodlawn. It's the landmark cemetery in New York City.
right.
So me knowing that I was bringing her back to be in her family plot next to her mother and father and grandparents was a very satisfying feeling. But it won't really seem real until I see the gravestone there. There's been a temporary marker since last August that people love taking pictures of. And, I already know lots of people have gone to visit. But this will be it. This will be a beautiful granite stone that our fans helped, sponsor. And that will be incredible. I've visited, people like Scott Fitzgerald, writers all over the country, but this is something that I think people will really, really be drawn to come and see.
That's wonderful. So when is the dedication of the headstone and the
On
detail?
her birthday, August 22nd.
Okay.
And the great thing about Woodlawn is you can take the subway right there. And it's like Central Park with monuments. It's
Hmm.
beautiful.
I've never been
And
there. I need to. I know it's historic. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so her estate, she still sells perennially, right? Is that estate still a significant sum or?
sure. So the funny thing is, the Algonquin Round Table was 30 members. The only two that have not gone out of print are Dorothy Parker and Edna Ferber, two of the women.
Mhm.
Parker's book, The Portable Dorothy Parker, came out in 1944. It has never gone out of print. It's had multiple editions. That continues to sell. I think the nice thing is that this civil rights organization, which is the premier civil rights organization in the country, if not the world, the royalties from her estate are funding what they're doing, whether it's Black Lives Matter or supporting, political candidates, actions around the country where, injustice is being done. That is very Dorothy Parker. I've read her FBI file, and she was followed by G-men for doing the same kinds of things that people are doing today as an American citizen. So I think it's really wonderful that they continue to reap the benefits of what she wrote all those years ago.
That's great. And Martin Luther King, when he got word that he was the beneficiary of her will, what was his reaction? I was included in the New Yorker article. I found it very interesting.
He had no idea who she was.
Right.
He of course, didn't know who she was. But it was significant. It was around $20,000, and that's in 1967 dollars. So that's a good chunk of change to donate to any organization. And so that really helped them. And then unfortunately, he was assassinated 11 months after Dorothy Parker died. And so that's when the estate rolled over to the NAACP, and they maintain it today.
So in the New Yorker piece, which I just reread, King was told at this dinner, and again, who is she? But then he turned to his guests and said, like I said, the Lord will provide. It was like it just came from the heavens. Yeah, she was, she was an activist in a way too. I know she was arrested, right, at the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, and had also written, not just entertainment things, but some critical social commentary and things.
Yes, you've done your homework. So what happened is the only time she was arrested was in Boston at the protest Vanzetti. And that really galvanized her. And so for the remainder of her life, she was a champion for social justice. And in one of the stories that was in the New Yorker in 1927, Arrangement in Black and White, which is pretty much a story about Paul Robeson. And Harold Ross, the editor, ran it because he thought it was funny. But it is a searing portrait of social intolerance. And that was very, very rare to see in a magazine like that in the 20s. And so she became very politically active, much more so in the 30s when she went to Spain. She covered the Civil War. She went to Madrid. She witnessed the bombings firsthand. Her name was associated with more than 30 left-wing causes. And that's why J. Edgar Hoover had her tailed like a lot of writers of that era. She was blacklisted in Hollywood. She had a very hard time, getting work before and after World War II because of her political leanings. But she didn't care. She continued to raise money for these funds. She continued to speak up, whether it's the Scottsboro Boys or anti-fascism or the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. And so that really, really became a focus for her as she got into her 40s and 50s. And so she kind of, disdained her earlier version of herself. And so she really, didn't like talking about the Algonquin Round Table any longer. She did not like talking about, those days. She stopped writing poetry during World War II because she was, trying to reinvent herself as a more serious person.
Right. What were her final years like? I have not, read biographies. I don't know her life that well, but it seemed like she was kind of alone. Her husband was gone. Her
Sure.
friends. Probably
So
she's outlived
she
friends.
well, she never took care of herself, like a lot of people. And so her last 10 years, she was in and out of the hospital, whether it was a bad shoulder, bursitis, heart problems. Her husband, her second husband, Alan Campbell, died in 1963. And then the following year, in 1964, is when she returned to New York City. And she went to live in an apartment house on East 74th Street, which is the same apartment house that Sarah Murphy lived in. Sarah Murphy was the widow of Gerald Murphy. The Murphys, of course, were very close to Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, and they're the basis of the characters in Tender as the Night. So Parker and Sarah kind of looked in on each other. They had dogs and they had friends. And, for the last few years of her life, she kind of led a very interesting life. She was befriended by Wyatt Cooper and Gloria Vanderbilt, who were probably the cream of the crop of the social status in Manhattan at the time. She met people like Truman Capote and Gloria Steinem, Norman Mailer. And so she, in her 70s, was, going out to, fancy cocktail parties, and, she lived alone with one dog. And if you go on dorothyparker.com, you can see these interviews of people like Steinem and newspaper writers that came to her apartment to get her thoughts on, current books or movies or, politics. And it's really interesting to see what she has to say about, the war in Vietnam and, the current, writers, who she's reading. Here's a news tip for you, Paul. I'm breaking right now.
Okay.
I just saw a video interview that Dorothy Parker in 1966. No one has heard it in years. It's 70 minutes that she did with Richard Lemparski, who Hollywood people know that name. So he interviewed her in March 1966, and a collector just a few days ago gave me the audio file. So I'm going to post it for her birthday for people to stream on their phones or on their desktops on dorothyparker.com. And it's wonderful. She talks about In Cold Blood. She just read it. It had just come out 2 weeks before, how powerful it was. She speaks about, Vietnam and, current writers. And so she was really, she had her wits. She never suffered from any memory loss or Alzheimer's or anything. She was working right up until the end. And then, heart disease took her when she was 73.
Yeah, an amazing life. I mean, you have written about and given tours about so many famous New Yorkers, which is really, the center of American and so much of world culture and history. Does anyone else rank at that top shelf with Dorothy Parker, of the people you've studied, written about, given tours about?
I really love the 20s and 30s. I also give a walking tour of Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald's New York, which is very fun because it's hotel lobbies, street corners, the fountain outside the Plaza Hotel where they jumped in, and for people that really know Gatsby and really know Fitzgerald's short fiction, all those places are real places.
Right.
So all the scenes set in the Plaza or on Fifth Avenue or in the Biltmore Hotel, we walked all those. And so it's kind of what I like about literary tours, Paul, is you might love a book or love this writer, but what can you do next? Well, you can walk in their footsteps, right, and know what it's like on an August day in the same time of the year that this author was writing this work. And that's really fun. I can't tell you how many people have come from all over the world to take one of my tours because they are fans of that writer. And this is, a gift to themselves, is to take it to the next level and see the places through their eyes that were the same as the writers. When we do our walking tour on the 21st, I'm asking people to bring their dogs because Dorothy Parker loved dogs ever since she was a little girl. And it's fun doing a walking tour with dogs because the dogs kind of become the celebrities that, because everybody loves a cute dog. Right. And so that's really in the spirit of Dorothy Parker, is to have a dog with you. We'll have some birthday cake and have a toast and things. So that's very fun to do.
That's great. And I assume these fans and deep readers keep you on your toes. They must ask you things that you have to go back to your own books to remember. They probably know the minutiae of these authors.
Well, as any good tour guide will tell you, there's always that one person that wants to correct you. It doesn't have to be a Dorothy Parker fan. I could be in front of the Imperial Theater and someone will say, well, don't you mean the Booth Theater? You know, so they're all like this. There's always somebody.
So how has, I mean, I know obviously the pandemic shut you down and now I assume can slowly reopen, but now there's concern we might be having to roll back, different restrictions. How has this past 18 months been for your guide work?
It was tough. Not even a week into the lockdown in March last year, I did my first virtual tour. I'd never done one before, but I figured out how to use Zoom and I figured out how to sell tickets and do it. And so I converted my tours, even my Statue of Liberty tour, I converted to a virtual tour. And I did that all into last summer, late summer. Then after the lockdown ended, I resumed tours on a smaller scale with masks. And so I've been doing tours like that since last fall. It's not as fun, but now that we're coming out and people are vaccinated, tourists are coming back. I'm seeing a lot more people from out of town in New York City. And so slowly, restarting the tour business. It hasn't been anywhere near what it was in 2019, but it's creeping back up. I was just writing to Woodlawn Cemetery. I do trolley tours for them now. And we're setting a schedule to do trolley tours in the fall of places around the cemetery related to, Dorothy Parker and George M. Cohan and Irving Berlin and, other, writers of the era.
That's great. I appreciate your time. This has been a really interesting, engrossing conversation with Kevin C. Fitzpatrick. He's a licensed New York City sightseeing guide. He's the president of the Dorothy Parker Society. He's the author of several books, including at least 4 books on Dorothy Parker. And he engineered and spent 15 plus years to bring Dorothy Parker's remains home and be rededicating with a headstone later this month at the Woodlawn Cemetery. Kevin, this has been really interesting. I appreciate you being on the conversation.
Thank you, Paul. And I hope to see some of your fans and viewers in New York City.
Absolutely.
For all the information, just look at dorothyparker.com and you can find out all the information.
All right, dorothyparker.com. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Paul.